you all for being with us for another one of these exciting and engaging events that have been such a sort of source of light in dark times. Really helpful to see all the ways in which people all over the country and even the world have been holding a special place in their hearts for Olana. And we've been particularly focusing on projects out there in the wider world that touch on parts of the Olana world, and this is no exception. We've got a really special guest here today. I'm excited to introduce to you all. Caitlin Condell is here and head of the Department of Drawings, Prints, and Graphic Design at Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City. The Cooper Hewitt, as you may know, if you're a friend of Olana, is a particularly important relationship for us, a special relationship, as they say in the Anglo-American world, a place that holds a really important repository of Frederic Church material that used to be in the Olana collection. So they're a regular lender to our projects, and we're often in correspondence. So we always pay very close attention to their programs at the Cooper Hewitt, and there was, up until the time of this calamity in the world, a very exciting exhibition there that Caitlin put together called After Icebergs. We had a chance to go and visit this exhibition with a number of members of the senior staff and board of Olana. And we're blown away. These incredible images that you're going to see tonight, beautiful, sensitive, almost minimalist oil studies of icebergs. And Caitlin has given them really rich context and brought them into dialogue with contemporary events. So you're in for a treat. Caitlin oversees a collection even larger than Olana's own. We proudly proclaim something like 90,000 objects in the permanent collection of Olana that few people know about. Caitlin's got me beat with 147,000 works on paper in her care at that wonderful repository. In addition to her work with the legacy of Frederic Church, she's also done a fair bit of work with modern and contemporary art and graphic design projects that include how posters work, making design, and she was one of the key contributors to Nature, the Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial. She also curated Making Room, the space between 2 and 3 dimensions for Mask Mocha. So she's had quite a wide impact on the field. We're all looking forward to her next project, for which she was awarded a fellowship from the Victoria and Albert Museum, Underground Modernist, E. McKnight Kaufer, opening in December 2020. So Caitlin, if you wouldn't mind switching on your camera and letting us see that face of yours, we are all very excited to hear from you tonight. So we are all inaudibly clapping for you. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Will. I want to thank Sean, Margot, Will, and everyone at the Olana Partnership for inviting me here today, and for all of you for tuning in from your homes. I hope that tonight finds you all safe and healthy. And here we're going to take a moment to really look at some extraordinarily beautiful things. As Will mentioned, I oversee a very large collection at Cooper Hewitt of works on paper. And the collection of Frederic Church, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, is one of the real stars of our collection. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it came to Cooper Hewitt first, and then talk about the show After Icebergs. So I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if it doesn't work. Okay. And please remember that apparently my head may be floating in the way of some of my slides, so feel free to move it around. The things that I want you to see today are the slides, not my face. But as you heard from Will, Cooper Hewitt's extraordinary collection of over 2,000 drawings by Frederic Church includes some really beautiful sketches of Olana. Here we show both an oil study and a graphite study. And it's a curious story how these came into Cooper Hewitt's collection. But as a result of the connections between us, we can show in Cooper Hewitt's collection many of the preparatory studies for works that you see on the walls of Olana when you're able to visit. Cooper Hewitt was founded by the Hewitt sisters. Here you see Sarah and Amy Eleanor Hewitt, showing very young women. And they founded the museum in the late 19th century in an effort to educate young design students about art and design. The collection was meant as a study collection. So here you see women from the Women's Art School sketching from drawings that are in Cooper Hewitt's collection to this day. Eleanor Hewitt felt that design drawings were extremely important to the collection, but she also believed that fine art studies were of equal importance. And as she wrote in this essay on the making of a modern museum, she said that as quickly as they can be acquired, leaves from the note and sketchbooks of artists of the last half of the 19th century and of the present day are being placed at the museum. The first conception of numerous well-known pictures, perhaps jotted down merely on an envelope, a box cover, or chance scrap of paper, are there to inspire and illuminate students and laymen. By means of such sketches, it becomes a privilege to see what these talented men, and they were mostly men at the time, saw all over the world with the Argus eyes of artists, so sensitive to impression of beauty, form, color, light, and shade. The value is beyond words, and not one atom of the work of an artist should ever be destroyed, since the study of the change of style, manner, technique, and character of work and composition from youth to age often adds valuable instruction, higher inspiration, and more lofty conception to the years of student work. It was in this spirit that three men came together to bring the Church collection that Cooper Hewitt now holds to the Cooper Union Museum of Decorative Arts. And it included Lewis P. Church, Frederic Church's son, Elliott Clark, an artist who was affiliated with the museum through his father, and Charles W. Gould, another artist who was a student of Elliott Clark's at the Art Students League. Elliott and Charles worked together to try to find a way to bring works from recently deceased American artists as well as living American artists into the collection. And in that effort, they reached out directly to Lewis Church when they learned that many of Church's sketches and paintings were still at Olana in 1916. This followed a series of acquisitions by artists, including Robert Bloom and Winslow Homer in 1914, that set the precedent for bringing in large quantities of the artist's working process, sketchbooks, leaves, oil studies, as well as some finished paintings into the collection. And ultimately, these made their way to the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, which moved into the Carnegie Mansion in the late 1960s and early 1970s, where they continue to be housed today. And when you visit the museum at any time, there's a strong chance you'll see a work by Frederic Church hanging on the walls, frequently included in many of our exhibitions, but always on view in our study center whenever anybody wants to come visit on the 4th floor of the mansion. Bringing us up to the contemporary moment, some of you may remember this image from April of 2017, when an iceberg came into Iceberg Alley in Newfoundland that was 15 stories tall. And this made international headline news. It was not in keeping with the size of normal icebergs passing through. Iceberg Alley, which frequently sees icebergs beginning in the spring season in April through the summer months, was anticipating many icebergs, but not one of this scale. And what was particularly remarkable is that even though it was 15 stories tall, that represented most likely only 10% of its actual mass. So the vast majority of this iceberg was below the surface of the water. And I saw this image and other images of this moment in Newfoundland, such as this one, as I was starting to work on a major exhibition, the Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial, which was focused on nature. And I did a little Googling and I discovered that in Newfoundland and Labrador, iceberg viewing is a sport almost. And people go and travel for their vacations specifically to see icebergs. And you can sort of predict the season. And it's become increasingly popular in part because it's become increasingly frequent to be able to see icebergs for longer in that season. And that is because the glaciers of Greenland are melting at an increased pace. And icebergs are coming off of the coast of Greenland and moving through this area between Newfoundland and Labrador that's known as Iceberg Alley. The exhibition that I mentioned, which I co-curated with Matilda McQuaid, Andrea Lips, Caroline O'Connell, and our partners at the Cooper Design Museum in the Netherlands, was intended to look at the way that contemporary artists and designers look to partner with nature. And it was a really optimistic look at the way that designers are seeking different ways and different perspectives of engaging with nature in their work. But it was also a moment of really intense research on climate change and the impact that humans are having on our Earth. In the midst of this moment, the UN climate report came out, and it became really clear that climate change was on the forefront of many of our audience's minds. So there was a continued discussion about ice and icebergs and glacial melts in the context of larger discussions about climate change. And one of the designers that wound up being featured in our show, Jorge Gamboa, took the metaphoric image of the iceberg to a really beautiful place, which was seen in this National Geographic cover, and which resulted in an image that was shown in our show. And you can see here, he's taken the form of a plastic bag and transformed it into an iceberg. And you have that metaphor of the tip of the iceberg, where most of what lurks is below the surface. There was this kind of amazing proliferation of images. It was so easy to find out what icebergs were in Newfoundland and Labrador on any given day because visitors were there and posting, and you could do a Flickr search or a Google search and kind of keep track of what was happening in the natural world just from the comfort of your own home or office. My colleagues at Cooper Hewitt were interested in looking at the collection as we thought about the triennial and what contemporary designers and artists were doing, and really thinking about aspects of our collection that should be brought out where we could see how previous designers and artists had looked at nature and how those works could also serve as inspiration. And immediately my thoughts went to Frederic Church. In 1859, Frederic Church traveled to Iceberg Alley, to the North Atlantic in Labrador and Newfoundland, and he went with the purpose of sketching icebergs. And he was accompanied by a pastor, Louis Le Grand Noble, who wrote an account which was published in 1861 called After Icebergs with a Painter. This account was a sort of travelogue, and it was also meant as publicity for Church when he released his major painting, which is now in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art. But it also meant that there was a really interesting opportunity to look at the process sketches which Church made while he was actually on this trip and think about how Church had observed nature and better understand what his experience was, what he had been thinking about, what he had been struck by, what he wanted to try to convey. It's a sort of unique privilege to be able to think specifically about an artist's process by looking at these works and really hone in on what we would like to think about in terms of the observation of nature and its influence on the present day and how we see differently when we're looking at sketches or oil studies than we do when we see photographs. When Church departed, it was in the context of the Arctic exploration age, and there were many different things that had come up in the popular press. So this had sort of taken hold with Admiral Peary's search for the Northwest Passage. And then in 1845, Sir John Franklin's expedition disappeared in the Canadian Arctic. And for years to come, this sort of mysterious disappearance was in the public press. And Eleanor Harvey, who spoke in an earlier webinar for Olana, has recently talked about Church and Humboldt and his interest in Humboldt's exploration as well. This wasn't an expedition in the sense that Church was seeking to make scientific discoveries or map new things. He and Noble were simply going because they wanted to be able to observe and ultimately for Church to be able to make a major painting. What I find really remarkable in knowing from Noble's account is that Church was almost immediately seasick, but he pursued the trip anyway and struggled throughout the trip with being nauseous and seasick. The swells were tremendous. They traveled on a steamship, which was named the Merlin, from Halifax, Nova Scotia to St. John's in Newfoundland. And then they chartered a schooner, which was taking them through the rest of their 6-week expedition. That schooner was called the Integrity, but they frequently disembarked to get on a rowboat to be able to get closer. And you'll see in this very small sketch in Cooper Hewitt's collection that Church shows here, this small iceberg off in the distance, and a rowboat. So I'll show with my pointer in case you can't see it, the rowboat with a figure here and the iceberg here. When Church and Noble began their trip, they were disappointed because they had expected to be able to see icebergs more easily. But as it turned out, days would pass without being able to spot hardly any. And there were times when one would appear in the distance, but things would move too quickly for Church to be able to paint or sketch hardly at all. And I like to think about this as I look through some of Church's oil sketches, because you can see the faintness with which he's able to take the form of the iceberg and bring it up in what's such a minimal amount of oil paint. But if you think about what Church was having to do on this boat, feeling seasick, and looking out into a moving landscape, constantly moving water, constantly moving light, constantly moving clouds, and constantly moving icebergs, I find it extraordinary that he was able to produce these really exquisite sketches. So you can see there are moments where they come off the horizon, and Noble described this as almost like a pinprick that would suddenly come into view. And sometimes the clouds would shift or the light would change, and all of a sudden a dark mass that was hardly discernible at all would become this vibrant blue, green, white mass that Church was tremendously enamored of. Church sketched on 3 different types of materials. The first was a sketchbook, which was disbound long after the trip. And these sketchbook pages, one of which you see here on the left, are very small, and Church would sketch rapidly with pencil, really trying to work out just the form of the iceberg. And he would make inscriptions and notes, sometimes documenting the day that he saw it, sometimes making some notes about his impressions or the colors that he saw. And what was really exciting for this project was the wonderful research conducted by Cooper Hewitt's American Art Research Assistant, Laura Fravel, without whom this exhibition could never have happened. And she took After Icebergs with a Painter, the book by Noble, and compared the engravings that were included in the book with Cooper Hewitt's sketches, and identified that in some instances, the drawings that appeared in Church's sketches, such as this one right here, were taken almost exactly and turned into the engravings featured. Here is another example of that, and you can see this extraordinary ice architecture as Church described it, replicated here. And in a final comparison, and one that I find extremely charming, you can see how this iceberg form has been changed just a little bit, but the schooner has changed dramatically. And here I think that Church's sense of scale is actually more akin to what is described in the book as him having experienced, where these massive icebergs dwarfed the scale of the actual boat. Church also sketched on a type of green paper that was larger. And here I've shown just one, and I'm showing you a detail. It's extremely hard to read on the screen, so we won't linger on these. But he would work out, again, the forms of the iceberg and make inscriptions and notes and highlights with white gouache. And these, again, were preparatory so that he could return to them later on the boat or in his studio back in New York when he was ready. Noble described both his and Church's impressions of what they were seeing in an incredibly eloquent way. And here I'll read a few quotes as we move through these slides. Every curve, swell, and depression have the finish of the most exquisite sculpture, and all drips with silvery water as if newly risen from the deep. And here you can see the extraordinary sort of blue-green transition, which marks where the iceberg hits the water and indicates the huge mass of iceberg that is beneath the surface. Church was really interested in looking at what was happening to the surface of an iceberg. So he worked to describe the fractures and the shadows of the iceberg, which formed from the iceberg melting, from it turning over into the water, from a variety of different factors. But you can see here in this sketch, which is oil on paperboard and which tended to be the largest of Church's sketches, that he's actually quickly working out a variety of different forms of icebergs. In some cases, he was traveling on the boat and would chase down icebergs that he could see in a distance. And if the icebergs were moving slowly, he would be able to move around the iceberg to be able to capture it from different vantage points. But just as quickly as he would move, the light might change, and Church would have to reconstruct his understanding or start afresh. Here you see another one of these multiple sketches on one paper, where you can see that Church is actually moving around the same iceberg. And you can see that the way that he builds up the form is incredibly quick in some cases, almost brushy in its effect. This particular corner is one that I find fascinating. Noble described that the best time to see icebergs, the best light, was at sunset. And he wrote that if you would behold perfect brilliancy, gaze at the crest of an iceberg cutting sharply into the red heavens. And this is the only sketch that we have of Church that seems to indicate a sketch at that time. But Noble also notes that they actually, at night, would continue to look for icebergs, and at one point took a tar barrel and threw it a light into the water to try to illuminate the icebergs so that Church could have another opportunity to sketch them. Church would start early in the day and work into the night, and you can see through his sketches the ways in which light would play on the surface of both the iceberg and the water and impact his ability to see. And here is one of the few instances where you sort of have a sense of an almost pure white iceberg, a very bright time of day, and relatively calm seas. But not all of the icebergs were shown in that particular light. And Noble noted how extraordinary it was that icebergs would take on different familiar or unfamiliar forms depending on the particular moment at which they were looking at them. He wrote, icebergs to the imaginative soul have a kind of individuality in life. They startle, frighten, awe. They astonish and excite, amuse and delight, and fascinate. Clouds, mountains, and structures, angels, demons, animals, and men spring to the view of the beholder. This beautiful, extraordinarily large iceberg oil sketch is one of my favorites in the collection. And here you can get the sense that Church really had time to work up the form of this iceberg. You can see that he begins to really work through details, particularly in this section, somewhat unusual for these oil sketches that were made really on the fly. Here again, you can get a sense of the incredible light that Church experienced standing on the schooner and looking out over yet another iceberg form. He described spending sometimes minutes, sometimes hours on the sketches. He would start from that outline form. He would quickly move to oil if he had that opportunity. And here, he really focuses on the form of the iceberg and on the way in which the light falls across that surface here. Church and Noble were both sort of fascinated by the way in which icebergs were shaped by the elements. And you could tell in some of these that he was really showing the ways in which these forms created these magisterial architectural sensibilities. This was something that ultimately Church would become fascinated in when he made his large painting, but he really stayed true to what he was seeing because this is where he was looking for information and the observation was the key moment. What's notable here is the choppiness also of the water. Church frequently kept the water sketches to a minimum, but always indicated the sense of calm or the sense of seasickness that he was sort of experiencing when he was in the process of sketching. This is a very small sketch in the collection, but one that I particularly love. It's almost a small torn piece, but you can see that Church has scraped into the paper to try to convey the iceberg. Noble wrote that frequently they would be moving around and it would be like white ice in their eyes, and the ocean would look purple, and then the clouds would shift or a ray of light would come through, and suddenly they'd be able to see the iceberg, but the color of the water would continue to change right before their eyes. Icebergs are a favorite playground of the lines and surfaces, Noble wrote, and shapes of the whole world. The heavens above, the earth and the waters under, of their sounds and motions and colors also. And the sounds was something that I was particularly fascinated by and struggled to figure out how to convey in the context of an exhibition. And ultimately, Laura Fravel and I worked with Mir Finkelman, our collections assistant, to track down sounds of icebergs from the present day. And these subterranean recordings that were made by a university will be shared in a link at the end of the presentation and are on view with headphones in the gallery, so that you can really spend a moment meditating on the fact that this is not a silent experience for Church and Noble, but that the cracking of icebergs, the motion of them, is actually a very sonar experience. Here again, Church captures this really brilliant moment. And you can have a sense that he is capturing the shadows as an iceberg is really moving quickly through the water, and as his boat is struggling to keep up with it. And again, the extraordinary choppy seas that he was experiencing. Ultimately, Church was quite fascinated by the iceberg experience that he had. He described in some inscriptions that they felt supernatural. And Noble really argued quite the same. I know of no object in all nature so marvelously sensitive to a steady gaze, Noble wrote. One of the joys of this process was thinking about the fact that this was the 160th anniversary of Church's trip with Noble to see icebergs. So he went in 1859. This exhibition opened in 2019. And I had hoped that I would one day be able to travel to Newfoundland. I wasn't able to do it before the research for the show. But the Newfoundland Tourism Board was incredibly generous in sharing photos of the 2019 summer season with us. And Laura Fravel and I had a really wonderful time going through these images and realizing that many of the forms of icebergs that Church had seen in his day, as you see here in his sketch on the right, were in fact being repeated in 2019, as you see in the photograph on the left. And here are 3 more photographs that were shared with us by the Newfoundland Tourism Board, and which appear paired with other sketches that have similar relationships and forms to Church's sketches in 1859. One of the other really exciting opportunities for this exhibition was to bring the Church and Lockwood to Forest connection back to Cooper Hewitt. So as those of you who are fond members of Olana know, Lockwood de Forest was a mentee of Frederic Church and did a tremendous amount of ornament work in teak. And that ornament work is featured and integrated throughout the house at Olana. At Cooper Hewitt, we have a really remarkable connection because we are in the former Carnegie Mansion. And Andrew Carnegie commissioned Lockwood de Forest, when the mansion was built, to design the family library. And this is a remarkable photo of the library at the time with a wonderful Tiffany turtleback chandelier. There aren't as many books in this library as there were in Andrew Carnegie's private library, which was on the first floor of the mansion. But we're very lucky that this room survived many lives of the Carnegie Mansion. And in the preparation for Cooper Hewitt's renovation in 2010, a restoration of this teak room was undertaken. And you can see here conservators working carefully to clean all of the teak elements in the space. Sarah Coffin and Gail Davidson, the curators who consulted on the restoration and also curated the first show in this gallery once the museum reopened in 2015, paired a Lockwood de Forest on plein air sketch with a Frederic Church on plein air sketch. And here you can see when they traveled together in Greece that they sat side by side and studied the same subjects. And it was a really special opportunity to be able to bring that together in one of the few extant Lockwood de Forest interiors left in America. So for me, the opportunity to bring Church back to Lockwood de Forest and pair them with this exhibition was an exciting opportunity. And here you can see the gallery in which this small show is installed. And we have an opportunity to see works hanging against the wall coverings, and then also small sketches in the cases. And what's really exciting is that the beautiful tones of the teak room and the family library, as it's called in the Carnegie Mansion, really play against the cool colors that were mostly developed in Church's oil sketches. I also want to give a shout out. The After Icebergs exhibition is on view at the same time as several other wonderful nature exhibitions, Botanical Expressions and Cochineal, curated by my colleagues Emily Orr and Christina De Leon. So this exhibition is still on view. As soon as Cooper Hewitt is able to reopen, I hope that everyone will come to visit it. One of the opportunities for this exhibition was to think about the contemporary moment and what After Icebergs meant to Noble when he chose it as a title. It was really the idea of going after icebergs, almost like hunting. They were chasing down icebergs to be able to see them. But for me, the title After Icebergs also suggests something about our future. What is our potential world like when no longer are we seeing these 15-story icebergs moving through Iceberg Alley? There are some really wonderful resources that Cooper Hewitt has made available that Margot will share in the chat at the end of this talk. One is a Smithsonian Learning Lab that features works from the exhibition and includes those iceberg sounds that I mentioned if anyone is interested. And then I also want to give a nod to the work of my colleagues. Gail Davidson did an incredible amount of research in her years as the head of the department about the story of how Church's works and the broader American art collection came to Cooper Hewitt. And she's written a beautiful blog post that I encourage you all to read to understand the expanded story. And then Eleanor Harvey's extraordinary book from her Dallas Museum of Art exhibition, which was nearly 20 years ago, which explores the story of Church's major painting he produced following the trip in 1861 when it debuted. And that painting really deserves its own webinar, so I will sort of stop the story at that. And I'm really happy to answer any questions that anyone has about the exhibition, about Cooper Hewitt, or anything else.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. Hi, Caitlin. It's Sean Sawyer. I'm just popping in. I wasn't able to be with you at the very beginning, but I was able to join and hear the whole talk, and it's just fabulous. And the array of images that you presented are just so inspiring. And we thank you so much for helping us, bring this amazing exhibition you did with Laurel to the public, to our members. Thank you. I'm going to turn over to Will here shortly for the Q&A, but I can't resist getting my own question in there, which Will can decide how to moderate here. But, you know, when we came down to see the exhibition, which we fortunately did before things changed, and in that room and surrounded in the way that it was curated and brought together, there's such a strong impression of the way that we see his sketches today, and through eyes that have experienced the evolution of painting in Western Europe and America since that time, 1859, 60, 61 onwards. And you know, that there's something about there's something of Monet at a trot, or, you know, other motifs of the Impressionists that is so fixated about the iceberg fixation and that journey. And, you know, I don't know what you make of that, how you can help a layperson and you know, which I include myself in terms of painting, understand about, you know, the conception that he might have had of that process of sketching and moving to the Dallas painting, which I know you're not talking about. But I guess because I see, you know, you read the biographies of the past generation about Church, and they are, everything stopped once, you know, he had no desire to engage with the evolution of painting. You know, we talk about how that focused on Olana. So anyway, I wonder if there's any reappraisal you might offer about how we can look at the sketches in that context of art history and painting history in particular.
Well, in case there's anyone who isn't familiar with the extraordinarily large painting, Icebergs, which is in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art, that is somewhat of a fantastical construction that Church made based on many of the things that he saw. And a number of amazing American art scholars have talked at length about the details in that painting and the context in which Church made it. It debuted at essentially the outbreak of the Civil War, and ultimately sort of morphed in its intention over the course of both its creation and then ultimately its release. But one of the things that I was excited about is we've had opportunities in the past to unite the process sketches, which is what we looked at today, with that major painting, which wouldn't even fit, I believe, in the family library gallery. But to me, there's something to be taken away from the fact that for Church, he's working out what the important details are to try to capture as he's seeing. And so that was, as you say, there's something sort of modern in the look of those sketches. It's very different in feeling than what you experience when you look at a finished Church painting. And for me, it was a privilege to be able to just focus on those sketches, because you're really able to connect with what observation of nature is and how Church struggles to translate that observation of nature into visual note-taking that he's making for himself, but ultimately also offer us that same kind of one-to-one connection, I think, with how he's experiencing the icebergs. But I'll let Will jump in and speak more to your question, because I think it's a wonderful question.
I think that was a really cogent reflection. No need for me to jump in. I like that idea of visual note-taking. You've really helped all of us to see these things in a new light. Maybe we could see you in a new light if you would unshare your screen.
Yes.
And bring us back to discussion mode. I loved also some of the quotes you were sharing. I come away with all these murky reflections, and then finally a question of my own. You started to help us understand how these incredible objects relate to that finished work. Are they mere fleeting records that are just process works meant for later completion, or are they, as we look backward on the other side of Impressionism, works of innate beauty and real accomplishment on their own? I think many of us with those modern eyes can't see them as anything but. We had a question already from Professor Edward Sullivan of the IFA. Glad to have you here. That elephant in the room, the Dallas picture, is hard to keep out of this talk, even as we want to focus in on these things. So I'll get to that, but just some reflections from what you said. I'm fascinated by that noble quote that talks about the icebergs like sculpture, like nature's own artworks, and how that's this widespread trope in the history of Western art. Tulips as nature's art, seashells as nature's art for the collector's cabinet, and is there in the learned Reverend Louis Noble's approach to these things, as well as Frederic Church's own, a sense that they are this pure work of nature's own creation, this kind of fleeting beauty that you have to make an intrepid journey to sketch and realize. I was also fascinated in relation to the work we've been doing at Olana on Martin Johnson Heade for an exhibition that is now postponed to 2021, by your really interesting observation on how important in these works the formation of icebergs was, how they are giving us scientific insight into how these things came to look the way they do. And that's something that reminds me of Heade more than Church. And more to say there. Just an interesting observation, but Heed, who is often characterized as the Darwinian painter, is giving us hummingbirds in different states of life, flowers both in bud and in full bloom, and maybe there's something similar happening in the icebergs. So to the elephant in the room again, it'd be fun to think with you a little bit about that charismatic and controversial argument that these seemingly simple, seemingly transparent, beautiful objects are fundamentally engaged with the great conflict of their time. Eleanor helps us to see these things as somehow images of war, of in 1859, a country on the verge of all-out conflict, and in 61, a nation already there. How have you come to think about this from living with those iceberg works at the Cooper Hewitt? Do you buy that argument? You know these things as well as anyone now, and I'd be curious to hear how they speak to you.
Well, and one of the reasons that I told Will that I didn't feel comfortable speaking about the great painting, I first of all haven't been able to see it since I've worked at Cooper Hewitt. And the second is a lot of really remarkable American art scholars have done incredible research on that area. And I have not done that. I've really relied on those scholars' research as I have come to understand information about Church's trip. I think that for me, it was an opportunity to sort of put on blinders in a sense and look just at what the sketches were telling me. And that was what I wanted to achieve with the exhibition also, to be able to sort of pull away a little bit from that context and be able to pull them into the contemporary context just by virtue of bringing contemporary eyes into looking, and also understand that to see nature, to be in nature, what the travails that Church went through physically to experience it, what he's trying to convey. Church certainly put together the most extraordinary finished works, and nothing about Cooper Hewitt sketches are finished works, even though they show extraordinary skill in draftsmanship. So the political context through which ultimately the painting is seen, I think I certainly agree with Eleanor. I think that it's hard to imagine not seeing it in that way. But the time at which Church made the trip in 1859 is just a little bit earlier in the moment, and nothing about the way in which Noble writes about the trip gave me the sort of suggestion of thinking about the individual sketches and Church's fleeting opportunities to sort of see these incredible natural objects that are icebergs. I really, for the purposes of this show, wanted to pull back into what the works were telling us.
That's fair. Well handled. That was a masterclass in diplomatic redirection to focus on what is really the key focus of this exhibition. That charismatic argument is always in the background, but you're quite right, and you've done us all a really valuable service by showing that this 19th century painter still has much to say in relation to contemporary design at the Cooper Hewitt, this cutting edge place that is doing so much interesting work. We've had a couple of other comments pop up more than questions talking about the color of these objects. We've also had a comment about Olana's own holdings in relation to these things. So if we quickly mention the small number of drawings, as well as multiple states of the chromolithograph that was made from the later finished work, the North or icebergs, including this fascinating one that has oil paint applied over chromolithography, a reproductive medium made unique. So there's much in our own collection there that reflects on all this. Another reflection was how much there is in our collection of another Arctic explorer, Isaac Israel Hayes, pops up in Eleanor's project as well. But I've just been learning about this recently. The mountain in the Arctic named for Frederic Church by Isaac Israel Hayes, Church Peak, and the stone, the glacial erratic stones found on Hayes's journey that was brought back. I don't know if you know this one. This is good. And anybody listening, if you know where this object is now, we'd love to find it. A stone from an Arctic glacier brought back and set in a ring that was owned by members of the Church family. This real connection to Arctic exploration. It's not in our collection anymore. We don't know where it is, and it would be really cool to find that thing someday. So there's this abiding fascination with the Arctic, not only through that one personal journey, but also reaching out to other explorers. One subtext is how much Church is a scientific artist, and you've helped us to understand how much these objects were received scientifically as these rigorous documents of glaciology. Do you see them as scientific studies? How do you think about them as objects that were both useful aesthetically and scientifically?
Having the privilege of being able to see almost 2,000 of Church's sketches in our collection, by comparison to some of the other sketches that he made on other trips, I wouldn't see these as scientific studies. He made unbelievably detailed studies of botany and animals and other trips. It's somewhat remarkable in the sketches that there's almost no wildlife. There's one seal, I think, in one of the sketchbook sketches, but Church really stays almost exclusively focused on the iceberg form. But with that said, I think in part because they were constantly moving, so difficult to get up close to, and he couldn't sort of maintain that fixed perspective for very long, and the struggle of that is so potent in the way that Noble describes the trip. I don't know that I see these as particularly scientific, although it's clear that Church was absolutely capable of making that sort of detailed level of sketching, and that's very much the case in other trips that he took.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Seeing no questions from others, maybe I will throw in one more of my own, doing a lot of talking, but it's only because your work is so inspiring, and you really do help us to see these things differently. One thing I noticed just seeing you do your thing now is that there's a relationship between the finished iceberg work that does something very different from the studies, and also Niagara, which is that both paintings, both spectacular performances of virtuosity on a monumental scale, make the viewer complicit in their subject and engage with them in a sublime and dangerous way by placing you. That happens at Niagara, that famous gesture where there's no secure ground to stand on. And in the final picture, even as you said, Noble's talking about getting seasick, how hard it is to get close to these things. The darn things won't stand still. You are indeed standing still, planted on the iceberg. And I wonder if you have any reflections on that. What changes for the finished picture? Why was it necessary to show you standing on this slippery surface instead of just a 10-foot wide version of one of these studies from the water?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be totally honest again, I've been hesitant to guess at my opinions on the big painting because I've been so guided in my understanding of it through other people's scholarship and haven't had the opportunity to stand in front of it myself since undertaking this project. But it is extraordinary, the displacement that you feel, my sense from looking at the image of it. I think that there is a lot of political nature in that kind of choice and in that perspective. So it's a very different experience that Church is trying to convey for the audience. Then, frankly, I don't think the process sketches are intended for the audience in the way that the painting is. Church is trying to take in the entire experience of the Arctic, I think, that he brought to home into a single painting. And in that sense, that inability to have a fixed perspective as a viewer, to me, makes sense, that you can't quite get your bearings in the scale of that painting. But again, it's so hard. I've seen that painting so many times in reproduction, but the scale of it is absolutely tremendous. And it's hard for me to want to speculate on exactly what that feels like without being able, as an art historian, I just don't want to do it without being able to stand in front of it myself and have that impression.
Fair enough. And we all wish that we could be standing in front of these studies too to get their full power. And now that I at least have done so, and someone see this show, they do not disappoint in person. These are incredible little jewels. So we'll all hope that the show gets back open to the public soon. Maybe if we behave ourselves, Caitlin might loan us some of these things someday up at Olana. So we'll try to bring some of these things home someday.
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, that will be the end of our webinar. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.